believe that this will not decide. I love you. Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. A diplomatic spat of major proportions. The apparent attempt to isolate Qatar among Arab Sunni countries may lead to a number of unintended consequences. Is this all really about Saudi Arabia and Iran? Crosstalk in Qatar, I'm joined by my guest, Giorgio Cafiero in Washington. He is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a Washington, D.C.-based geopolitical risk consultancy. In London, we have Adel Darwish. He is a political commentator and author of the book, The Edge of War. And in Beirut, we cross to Martin Jay. He is a freelance broadcast journalist. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Martin, let me go to you first in Beirut. I read an article written by you for the RT website, I think it was June 1st, and you were pretty much predicting all of this, maybe not the magnitude of it. Let's talk about the magnitude of breaking these diplomatic relations with Qatar, because this time, you know, we've seen these kind of spats before, but this time it looks like it's, you know, it looks like it's going to be a lot more serious and a lot harder to undo. Go ahead, Martin in Beirut.
I think it's more than a diplomatic spat. I think we've gone to the next stage now. So, you know, what's really happening here is beyond. Nobody could have guessed this. And I mean, my article was spot on with a couple of things, but I couldn't have imagined it would have quite gone to this extent. You know, now people in the region here often, when you ask people from both sides of the polarized divide in the Middle East, you know, what's the real worry? Is it Hezbollah in Israel? Is it Hamas in Palestine? People often say no. The real worry in the region is Arab countries going to war with one another. And I think this is really something quite pertinent here. You know, we've got something which we couldn't possibly imagine. Saudi Arabia has felt the need to put Qatar in line because Qatar, as I wrote in the article, dared to think. It dared to actually question the fundamental basis of Saudi Arabia's entire geopolitical rationale in the region, which is that Iran is a threat, and we base everything on that, right down to how much we spend on defense spending and what we don't spend in other areas in terms of governance, like healthcare or building jobs and community. So I think we've taken this whole spat to a whole new level. Yeah. I'm hoping you're not going to ask me what's going to happen next, because no one can guess what's going to happen next.
In the second half of the program, we'll give it a try here. Giorgio, if I can go to you in Washington. Let's talk about the timing here. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump was there to heralding the unity of the Sunni world, and it was going to be Saudi Arabia was going to lead it. And now we see such fractures. Now, this has been coming. We've seen these squabbles before, but not this kind of, well, we're moving to the point of a breakdown. What's your take? Go ahead in Washington.
Certainly, it was relatively easy for Trump to travel to Riyadh and deliver the speech, which he did, but enabling America's Sunni Arab allies to overcome their political divisions and create a united front against an ascendant Iran, as well as extremist Sunni factions like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is extremely difficult. I think, obviously, Qatar's ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, other Islamist groups is a factor, but also Doha's foreign policy regarding Iran is key. Like some other GCC states, Qatar is pushing for the Arab Gulf countries and Iran to become more accommodating of each other, which clashes with what the Saudis, Bahrainis, and Emiratis want, which is a much more confrontational approach toward Tehran.
Okay, Adel, I mean, what's wrong with having a better relationship? I mean, it seems to me that that would be a win-win for everyone here. I mean, the Iranians certainly would like to have that. I mean, is it really just Saudi Arabia that wants to be the hegemon? I mean, what Saudi Arabia says, everybody else has to follow. Is that it? Go ahead, Adel.
Well, not necessarily Saudi Arabia. We've seen, actually, not only Arab countries, countries in Africa as well, severing relations with Doha, like Egypt and like the provisional government in Libya. They have different reasons. They have the Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar's support of Hamas. Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and also the ISIL, the Islamic State, and other Islamist fighters groups in Libya. They're also supported by Qatar, so they have their own reason. Then when it comes to Yemen, I mean, Yemen also severing relation with it, but that involves Iran. Now, it's interesting that actually when Trump arrived there, Trump is more popular in many Arab countries than President Obama was. Obama was actually seen as he was too soft on Iran. He gave too much to Iran in the nuclear deal. And he was accommodating the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, he was pushing for establishing so-called moderate political Islamic governments after the so-called Arab Springs there. So when Trump arrived, they see Trump as a new policy, a hero, and almost like the British established the Arab League at the end of World War II, which is an axle between London, Cairo, and Riyadh to contain American influence. Now that's been replaced by a new axle, which is Washington, Cairo, and Riyadh, in order to contain Iran, and to a certain extent try to contain also Russia. They see sort of Russian influence coming in. So that's actually the Americans' point of view.
Okay.
And that's how it happened. It's not a good idea, but that's what's happening on the ground.
Martin, two things here. Again, it looks like, and I'm not going to defend Qatari foreign policy, okay? But it seems to me that they're being denied their own sovereignty to have their own foreign policy. And number two, it looks to me that they're going to attempt a forced regime change or change the leadership of the country of Qatar. I mean, they're cutting the roads, cutting the crossings, the planes. I mean, this is serious stuff here. I mean, they're going to want a lot, okay, to return to the status quo that was before. It seems to me they want to change the regime or the regime's behavior drastically. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I think it's too early to say now. I mean, I think possibly regime change is one of the things that the Saudis are thinking of. You've got to remember that Qatar has a history of overthrows and coups, and the brothers of the present leader in Qatar are more pro-Saudi than he is. So regime change, I think, might be something which they might consider further on down the line. But I think in the short term, what they're trying to do is to simply destabilize the country and get the Qataris to get into line. You know, we haven't. The Qataris have always been the sort of wild card of the Middle East. You know, and if you look at their history, they're much closer to Iran than anybody else. But they dared to question an ideology, a certain way of thinking. And you know, I think this is. I disagree slightly with the Delhi London. I don't think that people, the Saudis and their partners like the UAE, are so obsessed with Qatar's support of Muslim Brotherhood. I think that's just a pretext.
Yeah.
I think that's an excuse. I think what we have here is Qatar threatening a way of thinking. And the way of thinking, the unwritten rule of the Middle East is Saudi Arabia runs the GCC, it decides on what the foreign policy is, and nobody has the right to question it or to even put their hand up and ask for some sort of debate. I mean, the Qatari foreign minister today said, we need to talk now. That's not going to happen. You know, I mean, what you have here is Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in Trump. It's invested heavily, $300 billion into defense. It's all based on a notion, a fallacy, a farce, which is that you have to have this infrastructure of defense against Iran. But it's exactly, look, what do these autocracies do when they get into trouble, when they start their policies start to fail and they start to lose the confidence in themselves? It's exactly the same as the European Union in Brussels as it is with Riyadh. When these autocracies start to doubt themselves, they can only do one thing, which is go for a power grab. And that's what's happened here.
Well,
you know, Qatar needs to be dealt with. It needs to be.
Yeah, but let me go back to Giorgio in Washington. I mean, you know, under the Crown Prince, you know, we see a Saudi Arabia that is on the move here in I would say a very negative way. It's disastrous policy vis-a-vis Yemen. It hasn't gone anywhere. Again, it's trying to circle the wagons to start an anti-Iranian program, and I think that's why they like Trump so much, because so many of the people around him have have an antagonism towards Iran. I mean, this is what's motivating the Saudis. They think that they have Washington's back. They have their back with Washington, and is that really good? Because you know, there's a lot of American military personnel in Qatar right now. Go ahead.
I certainly agree that Trump's presidency and his recent speech in Saudi Arabia are important factors in play. But let's keep in mind that the same three GCC states in action now also took action against Doha back in March 2014 when they withdrew their ambassadors. I think their objectives back in 2014 were more or less the same as they are today. They are trying to squeeze Doha and pressure the Qataris into changing their foreign policy, probably shutting down Al Jazeera, deporting a number of clerics who make controversial remarks on Qatari media platforms, and aligning more closely with Riyadh against Tehran. Obviously, these Arab Gulf states did not believe that Qatar's behavior changed enough as a consequence of the 2014 action. And now, along with Egypt and some other Sunni Muslim states, the same GCC states are putting pressure on Qatar, and this time this is more aggressive and the pressure is more intense. One final point, though, I think it's going to be very interesting to see the extent to which this pressure from three Arab Gulf states and Egypt can actually change Qatar's foreign policy. Keep in mind that Qatar is growing close to Turkey. It's very close to Western governments. It has a cordial relationship with Iran. It has growing ties with Russia and China as well. Given the fact that it has friends, allies, and partners who are influential in many corners of the world, I think it remains to be seen whether or not this GCC pressure can succeed in terms of achieving the Saudi and Emirati goals.
Well, as I started out on the program here, the law of unintended consequences, and that law seems to be applicable to the Middle East like never before here. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Qatar. Stay with our team.
You can see the border from here by the long steel fence that goes down this side, goes all the way down.
Like I said, this is autumn land, and this is autumn land. I have every right to be here. I have a right to go collect my food, be a part of my family on both sides of the border.
I started an organization called Arizona Border Recon. We are a standalone entity that is doing what needs to be done. In the 5 years, it's getting worse. The violence is escalating because it's no man's land.
Ranchers really get irate when somebody calls it a no man's land. They believe that their ranch is their ranch, and they don't believe that their federal government is taking responsibility for their security like they would for anywhere else in the country.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Qatar. Okay, let me go back to Adel in London. We heard earlier that, you know, that Qatar has a cordial relationship with Iran. Well, it's not surprising. I mean, they both share a vast natural gas resource under the ground. I mean, they have to work together just for at least for financial and economic reasons here. I mean, the Saudis want them to walk away from that as well? I mean, that's where they generate their wealth. I mean, I don't know anything else that Qatar creates or exports other than energy. So having that kind of cordial relationship makes perfect sense. Go ahead, Adel.
Well, I mean, first, you have, for example, the Omanis and the Kuwaitis.
Right.
You don't sing from the same hip sheet like Saudi Arabia. And I was actually referring to Egypt's motives, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is slightly different from Saudi Arabia. But you're right. I remember this emir, his father, once told me, it's only meters, few meters, just we share the same gas field within the Gulf itself. But speaking of the old emir, I mean, the son is not as actually wise and as cunning as his father or as his grandfather used to be in actually trying to balance the Saudis and the Iranians. And certainly he's tried to punch above his weight. And had he played his cards right and not hosted and supported all those Muslim Brotherhood, perhaps Egypt could have played a different role here. But yes, it remained to be seen. But I think what actually might affect some kind of the mediation that Kuwaitis wanted to rekindle and restart is the economic harm that would befall everybody from this. Today, the Saudis actually revoked the license of the Qatari Airlines. They got almost, I mean, the population of Qatar is less than the population of Camden Town. So all the foreign workers there from Egypt and from other countries would actually, when they start leaving, it will have bad economic effect. So that actually might be the wake-up call if some mediation is to happen and they start trying to go back into normal. But some concessions has to be made. Probably Al Jazeera had to be tuned down. Some of the Muslim Brotherhood leadership have to actually be to leave Doha as a price.
But don't you think, Adel, if I can go to Martin right now, I mean, Qatar it's a small country, very rich country, and it does have a multifaceted foreign policy, and that's maybe a check on the positive side for them. And they can turn to Turkey, Russia, Iran. They have options here. I look at Saudi Arabia over the last few years, and everything they try to do turns upside down and inside out. They just don't think strategically. They really don't. They generate more problems from themselves, and it's self-inflicted. Go ahead, Martin.
But that's exactly the problem. I mean, your guests have both referred to 2014 and today, but a lot's happened in 3 years. The Saudi economy has taken a hell of a pasting with oil prices falling, you know, and also you've got to factor into that Saudi Arabia's influence in the region, which was based so much on business and trade and buying people off, you know, that's just not happening anymore. I mean, a diplomat here in Beirut just told me a couple of days ago that, you know, the Saudis just can't buy the people in the region like they could before, and therefore you can't buy that influence. So this is all about influence and power in the region. You know, the Saudis are beginning to feel that they don't have the clout that they used to have just a few years ago. And a big part of this story is Al Jazeera. If Qatar didn't have Al Jazeera, perhaps a lot of this row could have just remained a storm in a teacup. But as Adel in London said, Qatar punches way above its weight on the foreign policy circuit because of Al Jazeera, because a lot of Arabs in the region watch Al Jazeera in English and Arabic. So, you know, you mentioned the Turks before. That's a really interesting point. I was quite fascinated by how quickly Turkey moved to offer to mediate. But in the last 3 years, you know, Saudi Arabia's lost its influence. It dares to say to Qatar that you shouldn't have these foreign policy ideas and you shouldn't play the double game, inverted commas. But this is just ridiculous. If you step back just a few paces from the map of the Middle East and look who's on the periphery and who is also playing that double game of having excellent relations with the West, but also Russia and Russia's allies in the region as well. Turkey is a very good example of that. Egypt as well which has excellent relations right now with Trump, is looking for much, much better relations with Russia and therefore, by definition, Iran. So this double game that the Saudis are so terrified of is actually sprouting up all over the place. You know, I think you touched on the point earlier about Qatar and its gas fields. I think part of this antagonism and bad feeling towards Qatar is also about business. It's about that Qatar was not hit quite so hard as Saudi Arabia was. It's the richest country in the world. It has the largest natural gas resources in the world. And I think there's a certain amount of jealousy there as well.
Giorgio, again, is to keep everybody in line, and there's that one issue that Saudi Arabia always focuses on, and it's Iran. I mean, and it's because Qatar won't toe the line on that. I mean, it seems to me it's very complicated here because the United States certainly wants to have good relations with Qatar. Its military is there, after all, very important military base in the region. I mean, you know, where does Washington and the UK stand on this? Because it's Qatar that looks to Washington and the UK for its defense. I mean, externally, to make sure it gets arms supplies and whatnot there. I mean, certainly London and Washington doesn't like watching this happen.
Yes, by hosting a major U.S. military base in Qatar, Doha has certainly had quite a bit of leverage in its relationship with Washington. Right now, there is pressure coming from certain think tanks and lawmakers on the Hill, as well as former high-ranking officials in the U.S. government, who want to see the Trump administration tell Doha that unless Qatar adjusts its foreign policy, the United States will move its base in Qatar to another GCC country, most likely Saudi Arabia or the UAE. There's a little bit of a debate among some people about how viable such a plan would be, but nonetheless, if the United States would move its base in Qatar to another part of the Arabian Peninsula, to another country there, Qatar would certainly lose substantial leverage.
Well, Adel, I mean, if you know, what's small?
I don't agree.
You don't agree?
That.
Okay, go ahead, Martin, jump in. Go ahead.
If I can jump in, not at all. I think it goes the other way. I think if the Saudis are really so sensitive and so stupid to actually push this situation to the limit whereby you actually talk about American troops leaving Qatar, I think this will actually go against them, and I think you'll have massive instability in the region and the ultimate nightmare scenario. You'll have one GCC member state which could possibly, as ridiculous as this sounds, be in a situation of conflict with the other countries in the region. So, I mean, Saudi Arabia is really gambling. It's really putting one round in the revolver and spinning the chamber. This is Russian roulette. I mean, it has no experience of foreign policy in the region, has no experience really of regional warfare, you know, and it's really, really gambling with the situation, and it threatens really to blow up in its face.
Well, you know, Adel, you know, going after what Martin just said there, I mean, this blockade that's being put into place here, I mean, in many cases, this would be seen as a declaration of war. I mean, the survival of Qatar is being put at stake here. This is existential here. And it gets down to what I said in the very beginning here. I mean, if I were Qatar facing this from my neighbor, Saudi Arabia, that can close the only land border you have, you're going to start looking north, and that's to Iran. And that's why I think this is the unintended consequence right here. You're going to look for protection here. Russia Russia certainly would reach out to help mediate something. It has good relations with Iran. It has good relations with Turkey. You know, I think this is a huge gamble. I agree. I like the roulette analogy. Go ahead, Adel.
Well, closing the land border is not new. That's been going on for the last about 35, 40 years. Because in fact, I remember when the regime changed in 1995, I jokingly I wrote in The Independent how the nearest pub used to be in Abu Dhabi, but the opening hours were at the whim of the Saudis when they decided to close the borders for the Qataris as land. So that's not new. It's always been going on. But I think the Iranians will keep out. I think the Iranians will keep quiet about this row, you know, leaving it actually to die among itself. I don't think what will happen. Interestingly, Al-Adid, the American air base, interestingly, that used to be in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
But yes. But in the late 1990s, when they were launching attacks against Saddam Hussein, cruise missiles attacks, the Saudis actually did not want the base to be used, and the Americans moved it into Qatar. Would the Saudis actually play the game of actually taking it back or offering another base for the Americans? Now Trump is on their side. That's again another one of sort of the games that can be played. But yes, I agree on Turkey's role. Not quite sure Russia can actually play that role now, but I think it's between Kuwait and between perhaps Turkey. And again, pressure from America on the Saudis might work. But I think a price has to be paid because the new Qatari ruler, Sheikh Tamim, has actually moved to too hastily and too loud and be too conspicuous about it. Things should be done quietly if I were in his shoes.
You know, Giorgio, one of the things that a lot of people have pointed out is that this quote-unquote war on terrorism in the region here, you have everyone pointing fingers at the other one. You support terrorism, you support terrorism. Depends on how you define it here. I mean, 40 seconds left there. How is this going to impact the conflict in Syria?
It's interesting. You know, Syria has actually been an area in the Middle East where the Saudis and Qataris have cooperated to an incredible degree. Obviously, while there's agreement there, Saudi, UAE on one side and Qatar on the other side have different views of different groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas. And these different countries have their own national interests, their own domestic political environments, and they have reached different decisions about which groups are terrorist organizations and which ones are not.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time here. I think we should all agree that Qatar is a sovereign country and it should have its own foreign policy. We'll see how it works out. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, London, and in Beirut. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
They will not.